Picture this. Winter, 1856. The Missouri Ozarks. A place so remote that when snow falls, you're trapped for months, cut off from civilization like you're on another planet. Now imagine twin sisters living in a cabin deep in a hollow they call Devil's Denver. To the outside world, they're healers, lifesavers, the only medical help for miles. But behind closed doors, they're orchestrating something so twisted, so methodical, that when the truth finally comes out, an entire community will have to reckon with their silence. Men keep disappearing, one after another, and everyone knows something's wrong, but nobody talks. Not until a young man named Declan Murphy vanishes, and his father refuses to let it go. What the sheriff finds beneath that cabin will shake you to your core. This isn't just a story about two women who committed unspeakable acts. It's about how isolation breeds monsters, how communities protect secrets, and how far one father will go for justice when the law fails him. If stories like this, the dark, buried truths of history that most people never hear about, fascinate you as much as they do us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're digging deep into the shadows of the past, one story at a time. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if you've ever heard whispers of dark legends from your own region. Now let's get into it. Devil's Den Hollow. Even the name sounds like a warning, doesn't it? And in 1843, it absolutely was. This wasn't just some remote spot in the Missouri Ozarks. This was the kind of place that made experienced mountain men think twice. A natural basin carved from limestone, surrounded by bluffs that shot up like fortress walls. 40 miles northeast of Springfield, accessible only through mountain paths that turned deadly the moment winter hit. And winter? Winter didn't just arrive here, it laid siege. Snow could trap you for months. Completely cut off. No way in, no way out. The nearest settlement, Cedar Ridge, sat 12 miles away through terrain so treacherous that even locals avoided it during bad weather. You were more isolated here than if you'd been shipwrecked on an island. So when two women showed up in the autumn of 1843, claiming to be healers, you can imagine the reception they got. Mercy and Temperance Blackwood, twin sisters, 21 years old, leading a single mule packed with mysterious bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. They spoke like educated women, carefully, deliberately, even though their clothes were worn and their hands looked like they'd seen hard labor. Their story? Simple enough. They were the sole survivors of a Kentucky family wiped out by cholera. Their grandmother had taught them healing before she died too, leaving them with nothing but knowledge of herbs and a desperate need to find somewhere peaceful to practice their craft. Now, here's the thing you need to understand about the Missouri Ozarks in 1843. Medical help was essentially non-existent. Real doctors? They were hundreds of miles away in larger towns, if they existed at all. Childbirth was a roll of the dice. Mother and baby both at risk every single time. Help could take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. So when these two women showed up and demonstrated actual knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery techniques, they weren't just welcomed. They were practically saviors. The sisters chose an abandoned trapper's cabin deep in Devil's Den Hollow. It had been empty for 3 years. The previous occupant had vanished under circumstances the locals didn't like discussing. But the isolation didn't bother Mercy and Temperance. In fact, they said it was perfect. Their work required quiet concentration and access to the wild herbs growing in the hollow's protected environment. That first winter, they reinforced the structure, established gardens for medicinal plants, and only ventured out when families desperately needed them. And people did need them. Mercy emerged as the practical twin. She handled deliveries, treated injuries, managed medical crises with an authoritative confidence that desperate families clung to like a lifeline. Her knowledge went beyond folk remedies passed down through generations. She understood herbal preparations and surgical techniques that seemed almost miraculous to people watching loved ones die from treatable conditions. She could stop bleeding that should have been fatal, reduce fevers everyone thought would kill, guide difficult births that should have ended in tragedy. Temperance was different. She focused on what mountain folk called the sight, an uncanny ability to predict things. Weather patterns, deaths, significant events. She'd show up at cabins hours before labor began, supplies already packed, as if she'd known help would be needed. Her predictions about harsh winters or early springs proved so reliable that families started planning their entire seasonal activities around her forecasts. By 1845, the Blackwood sisters had become indispensable. Their reputation spread through the network of family connections binding these isolated settlements together. Grateful families praised their life-saving interventions constantly. They were the answer to prayers in a region where death had always been too close, too frequent, too inevitable. But even gratitude has limits when things start feeling wrong. And slowly, very slowly, things started feeling wrong. Neighbors began noticing strange lights coming from the hollow on moonless nights, flickering through the trees like signals, like ritual fires. The twins brushed off questions with vague explanations about medicinal preparations requiring specific conditions. Then there was the matter of payment. The sisters didn't want money. They didn't want traditional goods. They wanted specific items: iron nails, coarse salt, red thread. Older residents recognized these materials. Their grandparents had brought these practices from Scotland and Ireland. Folk magic, protection charms, things you didn't talk about in polite company. But the most unsettling pattern? The sisters' particular interest in unmarried men passing through the region. They'd question them extensively about family histories, physical characteristics, details that seemed to go way beyond normal curiosity about strangers. Some men found it flattering at first. Two attractive women, isolated in the mountains, showing interest, but others found it off, predatory almost. Still, what could anyone say? The Blackwood sisters saved lives. They brought babies into the world when those babies should have died. They kept fevers from becoming funerals. How do you voice suspicions about women who've literally saved your family? You don't. You stay quiet. You tell yourself you're imagining things. And that silence, that choice to look away, to prioritize gratitude over gut instinct, that's what allowed the horror to grow. By the winter of 1854, 11 years after their arrival, Mercy and Temperance Blackwood had woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of mountain life that questioning them felt like questioning the mountains themselves. They were just there, part of the landscape. Essential, but essential doesn't mean safe. And trusted doesn't mean trustworthy. The community was about to learn that lesson in the worst way possible. Because while everyone had been grateful, while everyone had been looking away, the Blackwood sisters had been busy, methodical, patient, and they'd been selecting victims. Here's a question. How many red flags does it take before suspicion becomes certainty? Because by 1854, the red flags around the Blackwood sisters weren't just waving. They were practically on fire. But people? People are really good at explaining things away when they want to. Let's start with the lights. Those strange, flickering lights in Devil's Den Hollow on moonless nights. They'd been happening for years now, visible from miles away when the conditions were right. Mountain families would see them and, well, what exactly were they supposed to do? March up there in the middle of the night and demand an explanation? The sisters said they were preparing medicines that required darkness, that certain herbs had to be processed under specific lunar conditions. Okay, strange, sure, but these were healers using old mountain knowledge. Old mountain knowledge was strange by definition, wasn't it? Then there were those payment requests. Iron nails, coarse salt, red thread. Some families started feeling uncomfortable about it. These were materials their grandparents associated with protective magic, with warding off evil spirits, with practices brought over from the old country that Christianity was supposed to have replaced. But again, what were they going to do? Refuse payment to the women who'd saved their children? The women who'd kept their wives alive during childbirth? That felt ungrateful. Dangerous, even. You didn't want to offend people who might have connections to things best left alone. See how it works? Fear and gratitude, tangled together, keeping people silent. The pattern with unmarried men, though, that was harder to explain away. Traveling merchants, drifters, young men delivering supplies. Anyone passing through the region who fit a certain profile got special attention from the twins. They'd ask detailed questions. Family history going back generations. Physical characteristics, eye color, birthmarks, whether they were left-handed. They wanted to know about siblings, about grandparents, about traits that ran in families. Some men found it charming. Two educated women, living alone, taking interest in them. They'd linger longer than necessary, hoping for, well, whatever young men hope for when attractive women show interest. Others found it predatory, uncomfortable. They'd leave quickly, making excuses, feeling like they'd been assessed for something they didn't understand. And then there were the men who didn't leave at all. Marcus Webb was first. a traveling tinker who'd made regular circuits through the Ozarks for years. He stopped at the Blackwood cabin in the spring of 1845 to deliver iron nails, one of those specific items the sisters always requested. He was supposed to continue to Cedar Ridge afterward. He never arrived. His family back in Tennessee sent inquiries. The sheriff at the time, not Crawford, this was before his appointment, rode out to the cabin. The sisters said Marcus had delivered the nails and left. They'd seen him head down the mountain path. After that, who knew? The mountains were dangerous. Men disappeared all the time. Animals, accidents, getting lost in the wilderness. It happened. And it did happen. That was the thing. Men did disappear in the Ozarks. The wilderness was genuinely treacherous. So Marcus Webb's disappearance went into the records as another tragic but unsurprising mountain casualty. Then, in 1847, Tobias Fletcher, a merchant with distinctive red hair and green eyes. He'd been traveling with goods for sale, stopped at the cabin seeking directions. The sisters said he'd left heading east. No one ever saw him again. A man named Samuel Yates. 1851. Another named Jacob Morrison. Each disappearance investigated half-heartedly. Each one explained away as wilderness tragedy. Each one accepted by a community that had decided, consciously or not, that asking too many questions about the Blackwood sisters was more dangerous than staying quiet. But here's what's truly chilling. People knew. Not consciously, maybe. Not in a way they'd admit, even to themselves. But they knew something was deeply wrong. Women started warning their sons and brothers. Don't go to the cabin alone. Don't accept invitations to stay for tea. If they show too much interest in you, make excuses and leave. These warnings were never direct, never explicit. Just vague cautions dressed up as practical advice about not bothering busy healers. Men who'd visited the cabin during what locals started calling ritual seasons, periods roughly every 3 months when the sisters withdrew from their usual practice, came back, different, confused. Some reported memory gaps, time they couldn't account for. Others had nightmarish dreams they couldn't shake, sensations of restraint, the taste of bitter herbs, fragmented images of participating in ceremonies they'd never have consented to. But they didn't talk about it. Not openly. The shame was too great. The implications too disturbing. Easier to convince yourself you'd had too much to drink, or that mountain isolation was playing tricks on your mind. Several married men quietly confided in their wives about these experiences. The wives, in turn, quietly warned other women. A network of whispered cautions spread through the mountain communities, passed between mothers and daughters, between sisters, between neighbors hanging laundry or working gardens together. Don't let your husband go alone. Something's not right up there. They say the sisters practice old ways. Best to find another healer if you can. But never direct accusations. Never formal complaints. Because what if they were wrong? What if the sisters really were just eccentric healers with unusual practices? What if you accused them, and then your next childbirth went wrong because no healer would come? What if speaking against them brought some kind of curse down on your family? The mountain communities had trapped themselves in a prison of their own making. Fear of the sisters, fear of the supernatural, fear of social consequences, fear of being wrong. All of it conspired to keep mouths shut and eyes averted. And while everyone looked away, while everyone explained and rationalized and warned in whispers, the Blackwood sisters continued their work. Methodical, patient, utterly convinced of their righteous purpose. They weren't hiding, really. They were just counting on something they understood about human nature. That people will tolerate almost anything if acknowledging it means confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. And they were right. For 13 years, they were absolutely right. Until October 1856, when a young man named Declan Murphy made a routine delivery to their cabin and never came home. Declan Murphy was 22 years old. Red hair, strong build, left-handed. Details that would matter more than anyone knew at the time. He was the only son of Silas Murphy, an Irish immigrant who'd settled in the Ozarks nearly a decade earlier and never quite fit in. You know the type. Hardworking, kept to himself, had an accent that marked him as an outsider in a community that valued deep roots and family connections above everything else. On October 15, 1856, Declan loaded up a wagon with grain to deliver to the Blackwood cabin. Routine job. He'd been there before. The sisters had always been cordial enough, if a bit intense. He told his father he'd be back by nightfall. Nightfall came. No Declan. The next morning, Silas rode out to the cabin himself. The sisters said Declan had delivered the grain and left. They'd paid him. He'd headed down the mountain path toward home. After that, they couldn't say. Perhaps his horse had thrown him. Perhaps he'd decided to visit friends in another settlement. Young men were unpredictable, weren't they? Silas Murphy wasn't buying it. Maybe it was the way Temperance wouldn't quite meet his eyes. Maybe it was how Mercy's answers came too smoothly, too rehearsed. Or maybe it was just a father's instinct screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He searched the paths between the cabin and home, called his son's name until his voice went hoarse. Found nothing. No sign of struggle, no thrown horse, no body. Just absence. That's when Silas did something the mountain communities never did. He went to the law. Sheriff Josiah Crawford had held his position since 1852. Former Union Army scout, veteran of the Mexican-American War, a man who'd seen enough of human nature to know that disappearances in remote areas rarely ended well. But even Crawford, with all his experience, wasn't prepared for the wall of silence he'd encounter. He rode out to Devil's Den Hollow with 2 deputies, interviewed the sisters. Their story matched what they'd told Silas. Declan delivered grain. They paid him. He left. They seemed genuinely puzzled about why anyone would think they knew more. They were healers, not fortune tellers. They couldn't account for every young man's whereabouts. Crawford searched the cabin with the sisters' permission. Found nothing obviously suspicious. Medical supplies, herbs drying from rafters, the normal accoutrements of mountain healers. The sisters were cooperative, almost overly helpful. They even offered to help search for the missing young man. So Crawford did what any sheriff would do. He started interviewing other mountain families. Had anyone seen Declan after October 15th? Had anyone noticed anything unusual near the cabin? Did anyone have information about where the young man might have gone? And that's when Crawford hit the wall. The sisters? Oh, they're wonderful. Saved my wife during her last birth. Can't imagine what happened to that boy. Probably got turned around in the wilderness. Best healers we've ever had up here. Wouldn't know what to do without them. Every single person. Same script. Praise for the sisters, vague sympathy about Declan, zero useful information. It was too consistent to be coincidental. Too practiced. Crawford was a patient man, but he wasn't stupid. This wasn't a community that didn't know anything. This was a community that wouldn't talk. He tried different approaches. Interviewed people separately, hoping someone would break. Promised confidentiality. Hinted that he already knew more than he was letting on, hoping to trick someone into confirming details. Nothing worked. The mountain families had closed ranks around the Blackwood sisters with the solidarity of soldiers protecting their own. Days turned into weeks. Silas Murphy grew increasingly desperate and angry. He demanded Crawford do more. Search the cabin again, arrest the sisters, bring in help from other counties. But on what grounds? The sisters had cooperated fully. There was no evidence of foul play. In frontier justice, you couldn't arrest people just because a father's instincts told him something was wrong. Crawford understood Silas's frustration because he shared it. His investigation revealed disturbing patterns the more he dug into county records. Marcus Webb, 1845. Tobias Fletcher, 1847. Samuel Yates, 1849. Jacob Morrison, 1851. All men who'd last been seen near or around the Blackwood cabin. All disappearances written off as wilderness accidents. 1 missing man might be coincidence. 2 might be bad luck. But 5, with the 6th now being Declan Murphy? That wasn't coincidence. That was a pattern. The problem was jurisdiction. The cabin sat in a gray area between counties with boundaries that had never been properly surveyed. Previous missing person cases had never been officially reported to Crawford's office. Mountain families handled their problems internally, without government men getting involved. The nearest telegraph lines ended 40 miles away in Springfield, making communication with other law enforcement agencies maddeningly slow. Crawford realized he was dealing with something unprecedented in his experience. Systematic crimes protected by community silence in a region where isolation made investigation nearly impossible and jurisdictional confusion made prosecution even harder. He needed evidence. Hard evidence. The kind that couldn't be explained away or ignored. More importantly, he needed someone to break the silence. Someone who'd been to that cabin during the wrong time and lived to tell about it. Someone who could confirm that the Blackwood sisters were more than just eccentric healers with unfortunate timing. And in early November 1856, he found that someone. His name was Benjamin Thorne, 19 years old. He'd visited the cabin in September seeking treatment for respiratory problems. And what he'd seen there, what he'd barely escaped, would crack open the case and reveal the true nature of the horror unfolding in Devil's Den Hollow. But getting Benjamin to talk would require Crawford to promise protection from something the young man feared more than the law, the wrath of the Blackwood sisters themselves. Benjamin Thorne didn't want to talk. When Sheriff Crawford first approached him, the young man actually turned pale and tried to walk away. It took 3 separate visits before Benjamin would even admit he'd been to the cabin. And when he finally agreed to give a statement, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the coffee Crawford offered him. "They'll know I talked," Benjamin kept saying. "They'll know, and they'll—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. This wasn't just fear of retaliation. This was terror. The bone-deep kind that comes from encountering something your brain can't quite process. Crawford had seen it before in soldiers who'd survived things they couldn't explain, men who'd brush up against death and come back different. So the sheriff made a promise. Benjamin's name would never appear in official records. His testimony would be attributed to a local resident, and Crawford would personally ensure the young man's safety. Only then did Benjamin start talking, and what he described made Crawford's blood run cold. Benjamin had gone to the cabin in early September 1856. He'd been suffering from persistent respiratory problems, coughing fits that left him gasping, tightness in his chest that made farm work nearly impossible. The Blackwood sisters had a reputation for treating such ailments, so despite some vague warnings from his mother, he'd made the journey. "I got there just before sunset," Benjamin told Crawford. Temperance answered the door. She seemed excited to see me, not in a friendly way, more like I was something she'd been waiting for. The cabin's interior looked normal at first. Medical supplies, drying herbs, the usual setup. But Temperance kept asking strange questions while Mercy prepared what she called a diagnostic tea. Questions about Benjamin's family going back generations. Whether anyone in his family had unusual abilities. If he'd ever had dreams that came true or feelings that proved correct. Benjamin had thought it odd, but answered honestly. Yes, his grandfather had been known for finding water. Yes, his aunt sometimes knew things before they happened. Mountain families had these gifts sometimes. It wasn't unusual. That's when Mercy's demeanor changed. She and Temperance exchanged a look Benjamin couldn't interpret. Then Mercy brought out the tea. "It smelled wrong," Benjamin said. "Bitter. Almost rotten. She told me to drink it, that it would help diagnose my condition. But something in me, some instinct, made me pretend to sip it while barely letting any touch my lips." Within minutes of the sisters thinking he'd consumed the tea, their behavior shifted dramatically. They began speaking to each other in low voices, using words Benjamin didn't understand. Temperance disappeared into another room and returned with ropes. Actual ropes. Mercy started moving furniture, rearranging the space into something that looked less like a medical office and more like. It looked like a ceremony space, Benjamin told Crawford. Like what you'd see in old drawings of pagan rituals. She was making circles with salt, hanging herbs from specific places. And there were bones, Sheriff. Human bones, I think. Just hanging there like decorations. Benjamin's strong constitution, the same robust health that had let him resist most childhood illnesses, had protected him from the full effects of whatever was in that tea. He felt drowsy, sluggish, but retained enough clarity to understand danger when he saw it. When Mercy approached him with the ropes, saying they were part of the healing process, Benjamin bolted, just grabbed his coat and ran. He heard Temperance shouting after him, something about disrupting sacred work, about consequences for running from destiny. But he didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran down that mountain path faster than he'd ever moved in his life. "I thought about telling someone," Benjamin said quietly. "But who'd believe me? The Blackwood sisters? The healers everyone trusts? They'd say I had a fever dream, that the tea made me hallucinate. And the sisters, they'd know I talked. They'd know." Crawford pressed for more details. What exactly had the sisters said? What were the ritual preparations for? Benjamin could only provide fragments, words about bloodlines, about preservation, about children who would carry gifts into the future. It hadn't made sense to him then, and it didn't make sense now. But the terror he'd felt? That was real enough. "I think," Benjamin said carefully, "I think if I'd actually drunk that tea, I wouldn't have left that cabin. Not walking, anyway." Crawford's next step was risky. He needed to search the broader area around the cabin, not just the structure itself. The Ozark Mountains were riddled with cave systems carved from limestone over thousands of years. If the Blackwood sisters were hiding evidence, those caves would be the perfect location. He organized search parties, carefully selecting men who weren't as tightly connected to the sisters' network of grateful families. It took 3 days of methodical searching, exploring cave openings and caverns that most people avoided before they found it. Half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a cavern whose entrance was concealed by brush and rock fall, searchers discovered a cache that confirmed Crawford's worst fears. Personal belongings, dozens of them, carefully preserved in the dry cave environment, arranged almost reverently on stone shelves like artifacts in a museum. Marcus Webb's distinctive silver cross, the one his wife had described when reporting him missing. Tobias Fletcher's leather merchant goods with his name stamped into the hide. Jacob Morrison's pocket watch. Samuel Yates's hunting knife with the carved handle. And more. So much more. Clothing items from at least 10 different men spanning over a decade. Each item carefully preserved, tagged with dates in neat handwriting, organized with the precision of someone keeping scientific records. This wasn't opportunistic violence. This wasn't random. This was systematic, methodical. The work of people who'd been doing this for years with the confidence that comes from complete impunity. Crawford stood in that cave surrounded by evidence of at least a dozen murders, and a horrifying question formed in his mind. If these were the belongings of the victims, where were the bodies? He didn't want to know the answer. But Silas Murphy deserved one. The families of all these missing men deserved one. And that meant Crawford had to keep digging, keep searching, until he found proof of what happened to Declan Murphy and all the others who'd disappeared into Devil's Den Hollow. The Cave of Belongings was evidence of death. Now Crawford needed to find evidence of murder. And something told him that when he found it, he'd discover something far worse than simple killing. He was right. To understand the Blackwood sisters, Sheriff Crawford realized he needed to understand where they came from. Not just geographically, but spiritually. What belief system could possibly justify what they'd done? What twisted logic made systematic abuse and murder feel righteous? The answers he found were almost more disturbing than the crimes themselves. Crawford traveled to eastern Kentucky, to the region the sisters had claimed as their birthplace. He tracked down elderly residents who remembered the Blackwood family. And slowly, piece by piece, he assembled the origin story of 2 women who'd been shaped into monsters by something masquerading as sacred knowledge. The twins' grandmother, Elspeth Blackwood, had been what mountain communities called a granny woman. Part midwife, part herbalist, part something else that people didn't have comfortable words for. She'd immigrated from the Scottish Highlands in the early 1800s, carrying with her traditions that stretched back centuries into pre-Christian Celtic practices. But here's where it gets darker. During the forced removal of Cherokee people in the 1830s, the Trail of Tears that killed thousands, Elspeth had apparently formed a relationship with a Cherokee medicine woman. They'd shared knowledge, exchanged practices, and from that exchange, Elspeth had constructed a hybrid belief system that took elements from both traditions and warped them into something entirely new, something dangerous. She believed in bloodlines. One elderly Kentucky resident told Crawford, said certain families carried old power in their veins, power from before Christianity, before civilization. She thought it was dying out, and that only specific rituals could preserve it. And that's when their education began. Not just in herbs and midwifery, but in this distorted spiritual framework that Elspeth had created. The old woman taught them that they were among the chosen few, people responsible for preventing the complete loss of ancient supernatural abilities. That as traditional mountain culture gave way to modern civilization, these gifts would vanish forever unless someone actively preserved them through sacred conception. Think about that. Sacred conception. That's how Elspeth framed it. Not rape, not abuse, but a spiritual duty to create children who would carry forward abilities that could maintain balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. She taught the twins to identify carriers of this old blood through specific physical traits. Red hair, which Celtic traditions associated with magical ability. Left-handedness, viewed in many cultures as a mark of difference, of otherness. Distinctive birthmarks. Unusual eye colors. These traits supposedly indicated bloodlines tracing back to Celtic and indigenous peoples who'd once possessed supernatural abilities. By the time Mercy and Temperance were 21, By the time they arrived in Missouri's Ozarks, they'd been thoroughly indoctrinated into this belief system. They genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose, that they were preserving something sacred, that any man who fit their selection criteria was destined, obligated even, to participate in these rituals. The methodology they developed was chillingly sophisticated. First, establish themselves as indispensable healers. Build trust. Make themselves essential to community survival. Create a buffer of gratitude that would make accusations unthinkable. Then, identify potential victims. Men traveling through the region were ideal, less likely to be missed immediately, easier to explain away as wilderness casualties. They looked for the physical markers their grandmother had taught them indicated old blood. Next, lure them to the cabin under medical pretenses. An injury needing treatment. A consultation about chronic ailments. An offer of remedies for problems they'd mentioned in passing. Once isolated, they'd administer herbal concoctions that induced a state of compliance. Drugs that left men conscious enough to participate, but too disoriented to resist or remember clearly afterward. The plants they used grew wild in the Ozark Mountains. Jimson weed, which causes hallucinations and memory loss. Certain mushroom varieties that produce dissociative states. Preparations from datura and belladonna that create twilight consciousness, where victims remain partially aware but unable to control their actions. It was designed, Crawford later wrote in his reports, to create perfect victims, men who participated in their own violation while being unable to consent or resist, who'd wake afterward confused and traumatized but uncertain enough about what happened that shame would keep them silent. But here's the truly horrifying part. The sisters had been successful, at least partially. Birth records that Crawford cross-referenced with the disappearances revealed several cases of unexplained infant deaths attributed to natural causes, sudden deaths, illnesses that struck without warning, children who simply failed to thrive. The timing suggested these might have been children born from the sisters' ritualized abuse. And when Crawford interviewed certain mountain women in confidence, a fuller picture emerged. Some admitted to pregnancies whose origins they couldn't fully explain. Memory gaps around conception. Dreams that felt too real. Children born who didn't quite resemble their supposed fathers. Most of these children had survived and were being raised normally. But some, the ones the sisters apparently deemed failures who didn't display the supernatural abilities they'd expected, had died under suspicious circumstances. Deaths the sisters may have caused directly, viewing them not as infanticide, but as elimination of failed experiments. They never saw themselves as criminals, Crawford wrote. They saw themselves as servants of an ancient, sacred duty. Every violation was a ritual. Every murder was sacrifice. Every child was an experiment in preserving powers they believed were fading from the world. This wasn't madness in the conventional sense. This was systematic belief, structured faith in something monstrous. They'd been raised from childhood to see certain men not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as necessary components in a cosmic preservation effort. The most chilling evidence of this mindset came from the sisters' own records. Mercy kept detailed journals, not hidden away in shame, but openly, because she saw this as important work worthy of documentation. Clinical observations of victim selections, notes on which physical traits proved most reliable indicators, detailed descriptions of ritual preparations and their supposed spiritual significance. She wrote about human suffering with the detached tone of a botanist describing plant specimens. Men's terror, their confusion, their trauma, all of it was just data points in a long-term spiritual experiment. And for 13 years, they'd operated with complete impunity, protected by isolation, protected by gratitude, protected by a community that had chosen silence over confrontation. But that protection was about to shatter, because Sheriff Crawford now knew what he was looking for. And more importantly, he knew where to look for it. The root cellar beneath the Blackwood cabin had never been properly searched. Crawford had walked right over it during his initial investigation, never suspecting what lay beneath his feet. That was about to change. November 28, 1856. 6 weeks after Declan Murphy's disappearance, Sheriff Crawford returned to the Blackwood cabin with a search warrant and a determination to tear the place apart, if necessary. The sisters weren't pleased. For the first time since Crawford had known them, their composed facade cracked. Temperance's predictions about weather and death apparently hadn't included a vision of law enforcement returning with legal authority to search every inch of their property. "We've been nothing but cooperative," Mercy protested, that authoritative healer's voice now edged with something sharper. "This harassment is unconscionable." But Crawford wasn't interested in their objections. He had deputies with him this time, and Benjamin Thorne's testimony, anonymous though it was in official records, had given him probable cause. They were going to search the cabin, the surrounding grounds, every outbuilding, and any storage areas. Thoroughly. It was Deputy Marcus Hale who noticed the inconsistency. He'd been measuring the cabin's interior dimensions against the exterior structure, a trick he'd learned working construction before becoming law enforcement. The math didn't add up. The cabin's floor space was smaller than the foundation by about 8 feet on one side. "Sheriff," Hale said quietly, "there's space under here that's not accounted for." The entrance to the root cellar was cleverly concealed beneath a heavy storage cabinet that appeared to be built into the floor. It took 3 men to shift it, revealing a trapdoor sealed with a heavy iron lock. "That's our winter storage," Temperance said quickly. "Preserved foods. Nothing more." "Then you won't mind us looking," Crawford replied, producing bolt cutters. The smell hit them first, before they even got the door fully open. Not decomposition. The cellar was cold enough to slow that process. But something else. Unwashed human, herbal compounds, waste, fear. The smell of prolonged captivity. Crawford descended first, lamp held high. What he found would stay with him for the rest of his life. The space was larger than expected, carved deeper into the earth with obvious effort. The walls were reinforced with timber, and there were modifications. Chains bolted into the limestone walls. A crude pallet on the floor covered with filthy blankets. Buckets for waste. And on a small table, carefully arranged, the tools of whatever rituals the sisters performed here. But worst of all, collapsed in the far corner, barely alive, was Declan Murphy. 6 weeks. The young man had been down here for 6 weeks. He was emaciated, dehydrated, his wrists raw from restraints, his eyes unfocused and wild when the lamplight hit him. For a moment Crawford thought they'd arrived too late, that Declan was too far gone. But then the young man made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, and tried to crawl away from the light. "Get him out of here," Crawford shouted up to his deputies. "Carefully, and get the doctor from Cedar Ridge." Now, what Crawford found in the rest of the cellar was worse than finding Declan alive, because at least Declan could potentially recover. The others couldn't. Bone fragments, carefully sorted by type, stored in jars like preserved specimens. Skulls showing evidence of blunt force trauma. Vertebrae and ribs bearing cut marks. All of it arranged with disturbing organization along shelves carved into the earth. And Mercy's journals. Multiple volumes, stored in oilskin to protect them from moisture. Documentation of everything they'd done for 13 years, written in neat, precise handwriting that made the horror worse somehow. Clinical observations of victim selections. Detailed descriptions of ritual preparations. Notes on which herbal combinations produced the most effective compliance without killing subjects prematurely. She documented at least 12 murders between 1843 and 1856, with dates, victim descriptions, and post-ritual observations. Men they'd killed when the rituals were complete, whatever that meant in their twisted framework. Men who'd been kept captive for weeks or months, subjected to repeated abuse, and then murdered when the sisters determined whether any resulting pregnancy was successful. The journal entries about Declan Murphy were particularly chilling. He'd been their latest selection, young, strong, displaying all the physical markers they sought. They'd drugged him during his initial grain delivery, kept him unconscious during transport to the cellar, and had been preparing him for what they termed the winter solstice ritual. According to Mercy's notes, Declan had shown exceptional resistance to standard preparations, requiring stronger doses that had nearly killed him several times. They'd been trying to keep him alive until December 21st, the winter solstice, which their belief system regarded as the most sacred night of the year. The night when conception would supposedly produce a child with maximum supernatural potential. But Declan's resistance had complicated their timeline. The journal's most recent entry, dated just 2 days before Crawford's search, noted with clinical frustration that the subject's constitution proves incompatible with extended preparation periods. Recommend completing ritual within 1 week or securing replacement candidate. Crawford sat in that underground chamber surrounded by evidence of systematic horror, and something became very clear. The legal system wasn't going to move fast enough. The sisters were already planning either to complete their ritual with Declan or to select a new victim. And there were hints in the journals about who that new victim might be: the 16-year-old son of the local mill owner. Red hair, left-handed, from a prominent family. Everything the sisters looked for. Crawford climbed out of that cellar knowing he was in an impossible situation. He had overwhelming evidence of the sisters' crimes. He could arrest them immediately, but frontier legal processes moved slowly. Trials took months to organize. Jurisdictional questions would delay everything. And the sisters had already proven they had leverage, veiled threats in their journals about revealing the participation of respected community members in their rituals. Men who'd been drugged and abused, whose reputations would be destroyed if their victimization became public. Several of those men were powerful: a local judge, a wealthy merchant, men who might actually prefer the case disappear rather than face public testimony. Meanwhile, Declan Murphy was being carried out of that cellar barely alive, his mind shattered by weeks of captivity and whatever horrors he'd endured. The young man's father, Silas, waited up top, and when he saw what his son had become, the emaciated body, the vacant eyes, the trembling terror of a broken mind, something in Silas Murphy's face changed. Crawford saw it happen, saw grief transform into something colder, harder, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that the law wasn't going to get the chance to handle this case, because Silas Murphy was going to handle it himself. December 21st, 1856. The winter solstice. The longest night of the year. Sheriff Crawford knew what was coming. He'd seen it in Silas Murphy's eyes when Declan had been carried from that cellar. The shift from grief to something harder, more resolved. He'd tried reasoning with the man. Tried explaining that they had evidence now, that the sisters would face justice, that the legal system would handle this. Silas had listened politely, nodded in all the right places. And Crawford had known, absolutely known, that the Irish immigrant wasn't going to wait for trials and lawyers and jurisdictional debates. Could you blame him? His son was alive, technically, but the young man who'd been carried from that cellar wasn't the same person who'd delivered grain in October. Declan couldn't speak coherently, couldn't sleep without waking up screaming, couldn't be in enclosed spaces without panicking. The doctor from Cedar Ridge had done what he could for the physical damage, treated the dehydration, the malnutrition, the infected wounds from restraints. But the mind, that was broken in ways medicine couldn't fix. And the sisters? They'd been arrested, yes, but they were comfortable in the county jail, eating regular meals, sleeping in clean cells. Meanwhile, Declan would spend the rest of his life trapped in nightmares of what they'd done to him. Crawford had posted a deputy at the Murphy home, just in case. But Silas had given them the slip sometime around dusk. Just vanished. His military-issued rifle from the Mexican-American War gone with him. By the time Crawford realized what was happening and organized deputies to ride for Devil's Den Hollow, Silas Murphy had hours of head start. The Blackwood cabin glowed with candlelight when Silas arrived just after sunset. Through the windows, he could see movement inside. The sisters were there, apparently released on some technicality Crawford hadn't mentioned, or more likely, they'd never actually been held because someone with power had intervened. But Silas wasn't there to puzzle out legal complications. He was there for something simpler, more final. What he found inside would later be documented through the testimony of the only other person present, 16-year-old Thomas Fletcher, the mill owner's son. The red-haired boy the sisters had selected as their backup candidate after Declan proved too resistant. Thomas had been lured to the cabin under the pretext of a medical consultation, the same playbook they'd used for years. They'd administered their herbal preparation. He was already drugged, restrained, only partially conscious when Silas kicked open the cabin door. The scene was exactly as Benjamin Thorne had described months earlier. Ritualistic preparations, circular patterns of salt and herbs, bones hanging like decorations, ropes arranged for restraint. Temperance was arranging herbs in specific patterns, consulting a worn book written in their grandmother's handwriting. Mercy was at the table where they'd prepared their drugs, measuring compounds with the precision of someone who'd done this many, many times. They looked up when Silas entered. Not afraid, not guilty, almost annoyed, like he was interrupting important work. Mr. Murphy, Mercy said in that authoritative healer's voice. You're trespassing. Leave immediately or we'll. Or you'll what? Silas's voice was quiet. Dead quiet. Drug me? Chain me? Do to me what you did to my boy. Your son was chosen. Temperance said, as if this explained everything. He carries old blood. His participation was necessary for. She didn't get to finish. Silas Murphy wasn't there for explanations or justifications or delusional spiritual frameworks. He'd spent weeks watching his son wake up screaming. Weeks listening to Declan's fragmented, terrified descriptions of the underground chamber, the drugs, the things they'd made him participate in while his mind was trapped in compliance, but his awareness remained just conscious enough to know what was happening. The rifle shots were almost simultaneous. Two quick cracks that echoed through Devil's Den Hollow loud enough to be heard in Cedar Ridge 12 miles away. Mercy fell first, dead before she hit the floor. Temperance had a moment, just a moment, to understand what was happening. Her face showed something between shock and outrage, like she couldn't comprehend that consequences had finally arrived for actions she genuinely believed were sacred. Then she fell too. Silas lowered the rifle and stood there in the candlelight, surrounded by the ritual preparations, the bones, the evidence of 13 years of systematic horror. He made no attempt to flee, just walked over to where Thomas Fletcher lay drugged and restrained, and started untying the boy. You're safe now, he told Thomas quietly. They can't hurt anyone else. That's how Sheriff Crawford found them when he arrived an hour later. Silas Murphy, sitting calmly beside Thomas Fletcher. Both of them surrounded by the bodies of the Blackwood sisters and the evidence of crimes that had haunted the Ozark Mountains for over a decade. Crawford should have arrested Silas immediately. That was the law. That was his job. But he stood there in that cabin doorway, looking at the scene, and found himself unable to move with any real urgency. Silas, he finally said, what did you do? What needed doing? The Irish immigrant replied. They had another boy. They were going to do it again. And you and I both know the law wasn't going to stop them fast enough. Crawford couldn't argue. The legal complications, the jurisdictional questions, the powerful men who'd prefer silence over justice. All of it would have delayed trial for months. Months during which the sisters might have escaped, or killed again, or used their leverage to avoid conviction entirely. I have to arrest you, Crawford said. I know. Silas stood slowly, hands already out for the shackles. I expected that. They'll probably convict you. I expect that too. Silas looked at the bodies of the Blackwood sisters without any visible emotion. But my boy is still alive. And theirs, he nodded toward Thomas Fletcher, gets to go home safe. That's worth whatever happens to me. Crawford took Silas Murphy into custody that night, charged him with 2 counts of manslaughter, not murder, because the circumstances were extraordinary enough that charging murder felt wrong somehow. The community that had once marginalized and suspected the Irish immigrant would now have to decide. Was he a criminal who'd taken the law into his own hands? Or was he the man who'd done what they'd all been too afraid to do themselves? The longest night of 1856 ended with the Blackwood sisters dead and their reign of terror finally, definitively over. But the consequences, legal, moral, social, were just beginning to unfold. The trial of Silas Murphy began in the spring of 1857, and from the first day, everyone knew this wouldn't be a normal legal proceeding. How could it be? The courthouse in Springfield was packed beyond capacity. Mountain families who'd never attended legal proceedings made the journey to watch. Newspaper reporters from as far as St. Louis showed up, sensing a story that would captivate readers across the region. The prosecutor, a young attorney named William Brennan who'd taken the job expecting routine frontier cases, found himself arguing manslaughter charges against a man half the community considered a hero. Brennan did his job professionally. He presented evidence that Silas Murphy had deliberately traveled to the Blackwood cabin armed with intent to kill, that he'd shot 2 unarmed women without giving them opportunity to surrender or defend themselves, that regardless of their crimes, vigilante justice couldn't be tolerated in a civilized society. But then the defense presented Mercy Blackwood's journals. Reading them aloud in court was probably the most difficult thing anyone involved in the trial had to do. The clinical descriptions of victim selection, the detailed methodology of drugging and restraining men, the observations about which herbal combinations produced the most effective compliance. 12 murders documented with the detached precision of scientific observation. And the sections about children. pregnancies resulting from ritualized abuse, infants murdered when they failed to display expected supernatural abilities. All of it written in Mercy's neat handwriting with no recognition that these were crimes. To her, until her final moment, this had been sacred work. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as the prosecutor, because legal procedure required it, read entry after entry documenting systematic horror spanning 13 years. By the time he finished, several jury members were visibly shaken. One was openly crying. Then the defense called Sheriff Crawford. Crawford's testimony was measured, factual, devastating. He described the wall of community silence that had protected the sisters for years, the jurisdictional complications that would have delayed trial indefinitely, the powerful men who'd been victimized and preferred silence over public exposure, the evidence in the journals that the sisters were planning another ritual, already had another victim selected. In your professional opinion, the defense attorney asked, if Mr. Murphy hadn't acted when he did, would Thomas Fletcher have survived? Crawford took a long moment before answering. No. Based on the patterns documented in the journals and the preparations we found in the cabin, Thomas Fletcher would have been dead within weeks, either from the drugs they administered or from being murdered after the sisters determined whether their ritual was successful. And would the legal system have prevented that? Another pause. Not in time. No. The prosecution called Silas Murphy to the stand. And this is where the trial became something more than legal procedure. It became a community reckoning with its own complicity. Silas didn't make excuses, didn't try to justify his actions beyond the simple facts. His son had been tortured for weeks in that underground chamber. Another boy was about to suffer the same fate. The law was moving too slowly. So he'd acted. I'm not asking for sympathy, Silas told the court. I killed 2 women. That's fact. But I'd do it again if it meant my son comes home alive and another family doesn't have to bury their boy or watch him come back broken like mine did. The prosecutor tried to paint this as dangerous precedent. What happens to civilized society if everyone takes the law into their own hands? But the defense countered with a question that hung over the entire proceeding. What happens to civilized society when legal systems move too slowly to prevent systematic evil? The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was manslaughter on both counts, not murder, because the extraordinary circumstances couldn't be ignored, but conviction nonetheless, because vigilante justice couldn't be officially endorsed. The judge sentenced Silas Murphy to 5 years. Then something unprecedented happened. Before the judge could adjourn, a petition was presented to the court, signed by over 200 mountain residents, including several of the men who'd been victimized by the Blackwood sisters and finally found courage to come forward. The petition requested clemency based on Silas's service to the community in ending a threat the legal system had failed to address. The judge took it under advisement. Silas was transferred to the county jail to begin serving his sentence, and the community that had once marginalized him as an unwelcome outsider began organizing for his release. 18 months later, citing extraordinary circumstances and community support, the territorial governor commuted the remainder of Silas's sentence. The Irish immigrant who'd been suspected and avoided for nearly a decade walked out of jail to a community that now respected him as one of their own. He returned to his farm, returned to caring for Declan, who would never fully recover but slowly regain some ability to function in daily life. Silas Murphy spent his remaining years farming peacefully in the same region where his son had been tortured, dying of natural causes in 1871 with neighbors who'd learned, too late, that outsiders sometimes see truth more clearly than insiders comfortable with their own silence. The Blackwood cabin was burned to its foundation the day after the sisters died. Mountain families gathered to watch the flames, visible for miles in the winter darkness, consuming the structure that had housed such systematic evil. Devil's Den Hollow became known as Dead Women's Denver, a place avoided by travelers. A warning. But the real reckoning happened quietly, in individual households where families had to confront their own complicity. The women who'd warned their sons in whispers, but never spoken publicly. The men who'd suspected something wrong, but valued community harmony over moral courage. The neighbors who'd maintained deliberate silence because the sisters were useful, necessary, and exposing them meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Several families left the region entirely, unable to reconcile their inaction with their consciences. Others stayed but carried the weight of guilt for generations. telling the story to their children and grandchildren as a cautionary tale about the cost of silence. Sheriff Crawford used the case to push for improved communication between isolated mountain communities and law enforcement, better reporting systems for missing persons, clearer jurisdictional boundaries, precedents for cross-county cooperation when crimes spanned multiple regions. The Blackwood case became foundational documentation for how frontier justice systems should handle systematic crimes in remote areas. Thomas Fletcher, the boy Silas had saved, grew up to become a circuit judge. He spent his career ensuring that isolated communities had better access to legal resources and that silence would never again protect evil as effectively as it had protected the Blackwood sisters. In 1885, a railroad survey team rediscovered the overgrown cabin ruins while mapping new routes through the Ozarks. They found additional human remains and artifacts the original searches had missed. Among them was a letter, written by one of the twins' earlier victims, describing his growing realization of their true nature and his failed attempt to escape the underground chamber where he'd been held. The letter was preserved in county records, added to the documentation. Another piece of evidence ensuring the victims would be remembered and the horror wouldn't be forgotten or romanticized over time. Because that's the final legacy of the Blackwood sisters and the man who stopped them. A permanent reminder that isolation can enable unchecked evil, that community silence can be as deadly as violence itself, and that sometimes, in extraordinary circumstances when legal systems fail, ordinary people must make impossible choices between law and justice. The story still echoes through the Ozark Mountains. A warning, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the capacity for evil can flourish anywhere people choose to look away, and that sometimes the monsters aren't strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they're the trusted healers who save lives by day and destroy them by night, protected by gratitude, isolation, and the terrible human tendency to preserve comfortable silence over uncomfortable truth.